Almost. You remember this movie? I think it's back from the 80s somehow, where Bill Murray was trapped in the Groundhog Day, replaying over and over the same events and trying to get out of that. As you might know, it's a rom-com movie, so it of course has an happy end. But I think the feeling that he experiences every single day is it's all the same. It's the same every day. I cannot get out of that state. I cannot get out of that. I cannot actually move forward and make any progress. Why do I show that picture to you? What I often hear from clients that I work with is, well, it's time to define your OKRs again. And then it's kind of like, oh, no, not that again. Really? It's that time of the year again. We have to go through the definition phase and the alignment and talk to everyone and draft OKRs and be challenged if the wording is right and if the key results are outcome oriented and all that again. It doesn't really sound like a lot of fun. And I would say 3 components that are often named is it takes way too much time and I actually have something better to do. It's really not that fun. It's a complex endeavor. It takes a lot of effort and a lot of energy. And maybe sometimes you were questioning, so why do we do that? Like, what is the impact that we can actually bring with that? And so the question that I want to discuss with you today is, how can we stop this Groundhog Day phenomenon that we often face in organizations around OKRs? So how can we actually make them impactful, lightweight, and fun? Maybe again, if we already went down that road. So my name is Natalija Hellesoe. I support companies on various stages in their OKR journey, from the first decision making, looking into is that framework something that could actually help us solve our problems, into implementing and continuously improving them. And I also work with a lot of people when I educate internal roles like OKR coaches, process owners, and the like, on how to do that. And since I have a background in HR and transformational projects, I always look at OKR from an organizational point of view. So for me, it's not just a tool, a framework that I implement, but I always ask the question, how can we, as was just mentioned in the panel, integrate OKRs into the bigger picture, and then combined with these questions, how can we actually do something useful with it? So what I want to go through with you today are looking at these different topics through 4 levers. I want to look with you at the OKR frame. So what is already true before you define OKRs? What are kind of your framing conditions? What about the OKR architecture? Are there some levers that we can push to make it more fun and lightweight again? What about the OKR process and roles and responsibilities? So let's start with the topic itself, making OKRs more fun. I would like to invite you to just grab your neighbor and quickly discuss, when is an activity really fun for you? And for those joining online, just think about it for a minute and just write down and first answer in the chat, then we can accompany our discussion here. So just take a minute or two. When is an activity really, really fun for you? Yeah, just grab a seat. So you can also quickly reflect on a question. When is an activity really fun for you? Whatever. Let's see here what the others think. All right. Let's close the discussions. What did you come up with? When is an activity really fun for you? Any thoughts from the audience? Yes, please.
When I know why I'm doing it and when I'm successful in it.
So when you know why you're doing it and when you're successful with it. Let's add one from the remote community. When I learn something and when I can give something back. Anything else?
Having this flow channel between how I'm challenged and what my capacities are.
The flow channel, yes. Something else we've got when it's a joint responsibility.
And when at the end of the day you achieve something, especially if it's something goal, you achieve as a team.
You achieve something when it's also then challenging. And here Adriana is, for example, saying when it relates to the company's vision and purpose, so when it actually makes sense what I'm doing, then it's also fun for her. So do
But I want it.
when you actually want it, yeah. So it's not forced on you, but you actually, when you made the decision.
I also want to add to when it's challenging, but not have responsibility. Results.
So challenging, but not necessarily responsibility. So what you already see here is, first of all, there are different personal preferences, right, when it comes to when is something fun. And I think that's an important perspective when we ask the question, do OKRs actually have to be fun? And what kind of fun are we talking about? Are we talking about laughing throughout the entire meeting? Are we talking about something meaningful? Are we talking about learning something new? Like, what do we actually mean by fun? And maybe that's a first fundamental question that you can take back to your teams. Ask them, what is actually fun for them? And then see how you can actually make that happen. What I want to discuss with you, though, is when we look at the different aspects around OKRs, being the fun factor, the kind of positive impact that we can create with OKRs and the time and effort that we put into it, that's not necessarily a linear process where we can just say which levers do we need to change to actually make it more fun, more impactful, and less time consuming. The problem is that we have an interdependence between these constraints. So once you change one of the levers, that might have a positive or negative effect on the other levers as well. So it's not just an easy solution in terms of I change the OKR process in that way and all three aspects are kind of improving. So I want you to keep that in mind when we also look at how can we get to a solution. Because sometimes what people say when they want it to be more fun is they actually want it to be more simple, less complex, less energy draining. The problem, though, is, and that's a quote that I took from Natalija that I met at the next conference last week, and he said that, well, he actually believes that we cannot get to simplicity without going through the complexity. So the question is it actually something that we want to achieve to just make OKRs more simple? Does that actually fulfill a problem? Does that actually create a good impact? Or is it a necessary, byproduct that we need to go through the complexity and that will then maybe lead to something that is more simple and more fun in the end? So the tension triangle is the one perspective. I would say the other is, what are we willing to invest in the beginning to create a long-term positive impact? So maybe it's necessary that in the beginning we invest more time and effort into something and maybe even have a less fun factor of what we would like it to be, to actually make sure that in the long run we can have results, we can have a process, we can have people included in a way that drives impact, makes it possible for us to have it less time consuming and actually increase the fun factor. So I think the question is, as with a lot of things, what am I willing to invest now in order to make things happen later? Or do I focus on the fun factor right now and say, as long as this week is fun, we're all good, but then maybe I have negative consequences in the future?
Question.
Yeah, sure.
How do you bring that message across? Because, I mean, I get challenged then about people, they invent so many new methodologies, so many new things, and we don't know how long it stays, how long it remains in our organization. So how should I know that we will have that process?
So meaning is it actually useful to now invest time in OKRs since I don't know if they will actually be gone in 6 months from now, something like that? Yeah. I think it comes back to what was also just mentioned in the panel. Whom do you start with? And what you just mentioned is, I would say, a typical comment from somebody who doesn't have a current openness towards actually experimenting with OKRs, at least not yet. I wouldn't say that's my favorite target group to get started with to actually create a positive momentum. So I would probably not want to have you on the first team to make stuff happen, if that's kind of your overall attitude. On the other hand, I think it's totally, necessary to ask these questions. And that for me comes back to a certain commitment. Like if I don't have a commitment in the company to actually give OKRs a chance beyond 3 or 6 months, my recommendation would be don't get started. Like don't do it. Like don't get all the initial investments up, train people, get to know the methodology if you don't actually give it a chance. And for me, actually giving a chance would mean committing to at least 3 or 4 or 5 cycles to actually see certain results. And so I think as long as the attitude is that we want to have, and coming back to that, short-term results, I don't think OKRs are for short-term results when it comes to the cultural change we just talked about, moving from output to outcome and all the other things, because they take way more time. But to your point, how do I address that? To me, that's a kind of, I would even say, prerequisite in a company. Like if they're not willing to think in that direction, I would say everything else that you're trying to do around OKRs will be pretty hard. But keeping that in mind, let's look at the 4 levers and what we can actually maybe do differently in order to achieve that. So when we look at the OKR frame, what I'm talking about are 2 axes. So first of all, what is true for everyone in the organization before you start defining the OKRs? And then what is true for this particular team? So here we can talk about things like the company vision, the strategy, focus topics that are already set, something like maybe a team strategy or mission that you have on top, typically a roadmap, and there might be some current environmental conditions, like, for example, staffing issues. Then, of course, on top of that comes everything that is outside of the company, the market conditions, the environment, political topics, you name it, right? So that is already true before you start to define OKRs. Why I show you this slide is it's not about looking at the frame and then saying like, okay, these are our conditions, now we can create OKR, but actually challenging, do I have a frame that is good enough to then derive OKRs from? Because for me, that's one of the, I would say, most common pitfalls, and you probably talked about that already this morning, or hopefully you did, in terms of making OKR impactful, but also kind of using the lever of time and effort when it comes to OKR definition. Do I have a good enough foundation from the top on the purpose and vision side, from the strategic point to then derive OKRs from and then go into the execution? Because otherwise, what will happen is OKRs are kind of misused to kind of fill the gap that the strategy leaves if I don't have a sufficient foundation there. And that leads to, for example, hasty strategic decisions made in an OKR definition workshop. That is definitely no fun, and that is definitely not impactful. The question is, are we now setting goals in different teams that will actually align in a certain direction, or do we then have an alignment issue, for example, afterwards? So setting the foundation right, I think, can already solve a lot of problems, especially when it comes to miscommunication, frustration, times, and resources. So how can we make that useful for us? When you look at making it more impactful, first I would say I recommend look at the frame. Like don't create OKRs without looking at the conditions you already have, question and challenge them. Identify and close the gaps first. Like if you have a serious gap on your strategy level, put in your effort and time into that first before then turning into OKR. And update and discuss that every time. Like I assume that all of you work in an environment where your frame is constantly changing from one cycle to the other, in the environmental conditions, on the strategy level, or on other levels as well. When it comes to time and effort, look at the frame, but like don't make an hour-long exercise out of it. It's not an exercise of going into it deeply, but rather, do we have a shared understanding of what is currently out there and what is now relevant for the next OKR cycle? What you can do is just choose relevant aspects for this particular moment in time for this particular team. So what I, for example, do is I kind of mix it up between, do we talk about influential factor from the market perspective, from the environment? Is there a strategy update that we quickly want to have a discussion about? Do we maybe have a change in team setup or other organizational issues? Like what do we want to focus on today that we can have a meaningful discussion there and not just talk about everything? And speaking of the fun factor, I think you always have the possibility to use different formats for that. Just pointing out one, in terms of liberating structures, use discussion formats, make creative exercises out of that. It doesn't all have to kind of be a format where you sit together, where you talk with everyone and then have a result. Make it relevant. I think sometimes when we talk about the OKR frame, we keep it on such a high theoretical level that it's not really tangible for the team. So talk about the things that are actually relevant for that team. That's why, for example, I would always recommend to let the team name the environmental conditions that are currently most relevant for them and their OKR definition, not the other way around, that you just present what the company thinks is most relevant. And one exercise that I like to do, for example, is let participants bring or Google news headlines of current relevant events. Like, what is their current perspective, their current filter of what is happening outside of the team that is relevant for the OKR definition? That might even also lead to very good discussions.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Smart is relevant to the OKRs. Actually, we used to do smarts in the KPIs.
You're talking about SMART goals?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
So they say for the OKRs is possible, right? And we can use the smart goals in the OKRs.
Well, there are certain differences between OKRs and SMART goals. I would like to park that question if we want to go into that in more depth.
Because there's a relevant one part of the smart are realistic, relevant.
They are relevant? Yeah, okay. Maybe building a bridge to that, because we were just for the remote people talking about how SMART goals relate to OKRs and the part of relevance. So I think, yeah, sure, of course, OKRs should be relevant for the team, but here we're still talking about what actually informs your OKRs and what is relevant for that kind of discussion. Yeah. So not just starting on a green field to define your OKRs, but really making sure that everyone has a shared understanding of what is going on outside the team first. When it comes to the OKR architecture, what was just mentioned in the panel as an idea, and I would say, at least from what I see happening in the companies, we're beyond just having that idea, but we actually want to create a different reality, is how do we build our OKR architecture? What we often see is that OKR architectures are built mostly along functional org charts. Like, how many of your architectures look like that, more or less? Can I just see a show of hands? Like half of that. So kind of when you use your org chart and you use your OKR architecture, they kind of look pretty much like the same. What is often happening when you design it that way is that you kind of just cascade down OKRs. You don't really change anything about the way that you work with goals, but you kind of just copy paste the structure that you already have, which neglects a lot of the initial ideas around OKRs. So one lever that we have in terms of making it more lightweight, fun, and also more impactful is how can we change the architecture of our OKRs to then have a positive impact on these three factors. There are a couple things. First of all, use the different types of possible OKR sets. Like, don't get stuck within just creating functional team OKR sets because your org chart says so. Use shared OKRs, use strategic focus topic OKRs for virtual teams, use, for example, sub-team OKR sets and combine them in a relevant fashion. Then your OKR architecture can look something like the one in the middle. Or you might even come to the conclusion that for your teams, you can already build a really autonomous structure where they don't even realign with each other as much as the middle picture. So kind of open your perspective up for different architecture types and see, okay, what is the most beneficial to create a lightweight process for us? And how can we maybe refine what we're currently doing in the architecture to get a little closer towards that? The other point is, and I think that was also briefly mentioned in the panel, don't use it for everything, right? Make a conscious decision. What is the OKR part? What is then the business as usual part? But coming back to my initial quote, you only get to the simplicity by going through the complexity. That doesn't mean that it gets any easier for teams to do that. And this is maybe the relation to the fun part, having a transparent overview of where all the capacities go to, having a real sense of what are now the strategic focus topics, what is the business as usual, how do these two things relate with each other, and how do I now plan my resources? That's not an easy endeavor. And You can put in a joke or two, but it will probably not be a fun discussion. It will probably take a lot of energy. The question is just, is it still worth the time and the effort we put in because we get a positive impact result? Right? When we look at the process.
I guess that's a question.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Can you go back to the slide?
Of course I can.
Yeah, this is a question, like, what do you do with operating supporting roles or departments such as finance or HR, who have a lot of business as usual, basically, and not as much time for strategic work? Like, how do you deal with them?
So I work with a lot of HR teams, and I guess when I start with them, the question, first of all, is, do they already have something like a team mission, strategy, shared goals, anything like that at all? Or is it like the lady from IKEA mentioned, or like Nora, I think mentioned, totally new to them in the first place? If that's the case, I would say I would start with maximum one OKR set in terms of, okay, what is one topic that you can create a shared goal around in a strategic direction? If they already have that as a foundation, and I think we can go one step further. I would agree they might have a lot of business as usual. Nevertheless, if an HR team tells me that all we're doing is business as usual, I would hardly challenge that. Like, if you don't have any strategic focus topics, nothing derived from a strategic or mission statement, nothing that relates to the company strategy, then what are you actually doing and why? So I think that's then one of the conversations that I would like to have. And then over time, what I often see happening is that you start with the idea that you have 90% business as usual, and then you gradually move over to more strategic topics. Also not saying that in the business as usual that teams are often naming, there might also be a strategic direction. So the question is, if that is your business as usual, how do you want to improve it? What do you want to focus on in your business as usual? Or do you just want to keep 90% of your work as is? Then I would love to challenge that as well, because that's hardly kind of relevant for most companies in a very fast changing environment, that you just keep things the same for a year or 2 or 3. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's an excuse with my company. We're firefighting all the time. I mean, we're growing very fast, so of course there's always too little people for too many things to do. So it's always like, it's Eisenhower, not the important but not urgent thing. It's only important and urgent. So the OKR topics.
And there you would have a first valuable goal. Like, how can we move away from the firefighting mode into actually creating value and having resources for strategic topics? Then I would like to challenge the team to set that goal and actually change the way that you work in the next 3 or 4 months. Because otherwise, you will never get out of that status quo, right?
Just one question.
Yeah, sure.
The slide, the bullet points or the bullet action that you mentioned. Is the message here now that we shouldn't use the OKRs for all those scores, or did you cut that now?
Well, my message would be, choose what you want to use OKR for and why. So, like, I'm not a very dogmatic person when it comes to OKRs. I know there's a lot of literature out there, use OKRs for this and not for that, and this is the right way and this is the wrong way. I hardly believe the answer is that simple. Of course, what I would see is strategic focus topics should somehow be covered in the OKRs, right? I mean, that's the whole point of their existence. If you then include discovery topics into the OKRs, I would say in some instances also in product team, that makes total sense because they cover a lot of resources, and it's also sometimes useful to define an actual goal for the discovery phase. Health metrics, on the other side, should be something that you want to keep an eye on, but necessarily don't need to follow in terms of a lot of initiatives and tasks and so on. And the business as usual, as we just said, if you have a certain strategic direction in here, a continuous improvement project, then yes, something like that could also be as part of your OKRs. But I think for me, the bigger question is, make a conscious decision and know why you're including this and why you're not including that. So I think a general level of awareness in the teams would already help to distinguish the different things and make it clear for everyone, what are we doing here and what are we doing there and why. Is that clear? So when we look at the OKR process and follow the quote from the movie, I think that was after, 30 or 40 times that he lived through the same day. It was just like, anything different is good, right? Just give me something else, some other input, some other information, something else. So when we look at the OKR process and just structure it into the 4 phases of definition, alignment, check-in, and reflection, what are maybe some ideas to do something different that can add a fun factor, that can make it feel a little less, time-consuming, but it can also add a certain impact? One method that I like to experiment with some teams in a definition phase is the Disney method. Have you heard about that? Probably in a different context. What's the Disney method about? Oh, you were like greatly nodding, so I thought like maybe you have an answer for that.
Wasn't it the one with the different groups where you come up with ideas from different perspectives? Oh, yeah.
So it's kind of an exercise in taking in different perspectives, putting yourself into different shoes to look at a certain topic. Originally, it's a creative exercise, but how I use that in an OKR context is the following. So what I like to do, and as you see on the flip chart, is I like to have a first set of possible focus topics for the next cycle. And then you take the different perspectives of the dreamer, the visionary, in terms of, okay, what was the best case scenario that we could think about when it comes to this topic? What would be kind of the moonshot? What is the ideal scenario we're after? Then you take the perspective of the critic in terms of what could actually go wrong, what do we already see on the horizon, what are the risks, what are the challenges, and so on. And then the realist trying to bring these two things together in terms of, if that is our future state, our moonshot, if that is what we dream about, but if these are the conditions, what could be maybe a good compromise? And so the idea really is that the teams get into discussion from these three perspectives of the topic first, and then come up with a possible objective for the next cycle, because that will probably enrich the discussion a little more instead of just saying, I don't know, we want customer excellence as the next topic. What is then now a good objective to work on that? But to actually have certain level of depth in the discussion before you get into the OKR or objective definition. So in terms of impact, what that can bring is just a broader perspective on the topics, a little more substantial discussions, a little out of the box, and also improving a shared understanding of the topic. So one thing that I would see in terms of impact here is if you create a better shared understanding of the topic and a little more depth at the beginning, it will probably result in less discussions later on in the process. You can do that in like 20 to 30 minutes if you do that for 2 or 3 topics together with different teams. And a nice side effect is often that in the discussions from a different perspective, you already collect a lot of ideas for potential initiatives or tasks that you can use later on in the process when you then do your initiative planning or your roadmap planning. For the fun factor, I would say it's something new, it's something different. And what could maybe also be an idea is just combine it with a theme for your entire OKR definition. So like use check-ins that have a Disney theme, use that throughout the session, just make something out of it that is a little different than what you used to do in the last session. Another thing also is in terms of time and impact, I never do OKR definitions just in one workshop, because I believe that it actually saves you a lot of time and effort to do that in little iterations. So be prepared, understand the frame first, go into a first definition session, then maybe give the homework to the teams in terms of iterate what we came up with so far, and then have a quick follow-up session to finalize it and to talk about it, how to actually complete that in the cycle. So don't try to do everything at once, because normally after 3 or 4 hours, people are just brain dead and it's not actually getting any better, and definitely the quality is also not improving. When it comes to the alignment, one thing I've been experimenting with is using dependency maps in various stages in the alignment process. So trying to visualize the dependencies, the OKR architecture in various forms. I would say also there, everything that maybe gives a new visual anchor could be helpful for the teams. And as we also just said, I think the biggest lever to make the alignment process more fun and less time consuming is really to improve your OKR architecture in the first place, so that you don't even have to do a lot of alignment afterwards when you don't have all these interdependencies, for example, when you just work with the functional teams. When it comes to the check-in, one team I worked with tried that out, and I really liked the idea. They start every check-in with a joke or a comic around OKRs. So they rotate kind of the task, and so every week everyone brings a joke or a comic that is somehow related to OKR, and that's kind of the starting point of the check-in. Why not? This is one maybe to get you started if you're looking for something. So a classic Dilbert, I think there are a ton out there also around OKRs already. Yeah. And it can also, have a certain meaning in terms of addressing issues that the team is actually currently facing around OKRs, but just in a little more lighthearted fashion, right? Because just measuring stuff is probably not the end of the line. And the other thing is also mix it up in your check-ins, right? So you don't have to just go through your OKR sets one by one every week, but for example, name focus topics, like focus on one objective per week, focus only on one certain aspect per week, focus on what has actually changed over the course of the last 6 weeks. So only the change is not the status quo. Focus on the outlook to the future. So just kind of give each check-in a headline. What do you want the discussions to focus on? And then give the discussions a little more depth. And of course, rotate roles like moderation, administration for the key results, or whatever kind of roles you have out there. And then when it comes to the reflection, I think there are a ton of tools out there to make reflections a little more fun and impactful. Just to name one, the Retromat for ideas on how to, creatively set up the retrospective part. And I think there's also some leverage in combining review and retrospective parts in the OKR process. So for example, I always set a time slot of 2 hours for the OKR reflection, where I do both the review and the retrospective part. I think you can nicely combine it and still make it impactful if you set it up right, and if teams have a certain level of maturity that they're able to discuss both in one meeting without just mixing everything all together. If that's still kind of a challenge, then maybe separating it for the beginning would still be a good idea. But so basically what I'm saying is really think about creative ways to enrich your meeting, but not just with something that kind of adds a little fun factor, but think about what is then the double meaning behind it? Can we add something that is fun, but that also brings us additional value into the OKR process? And with all that, don't forget what was also mentioned in the panel in terms of actually integrating what you already got, right? That is, thank you for that. That is, I would say, one of the biggest levers altogether without breaking the line of sight that you want to create from top to the bottom in your OKR process, right? So we've already talked about business integration, but while I still name that after years and years of talking about OKRs I don't actually still see that happening in organizations. I don't see organizations actually doing the exercises that we were just talking about, looking at all the meetings, why we do them, what is actually the value of each meeting. Don't start every meeting without an agenda. I see so many companies out there who have that as a goal, but I see so little of them actually doing that and actually taking consequences out of that. And so coming to the last bit, roles and responsibilities. So that's kind of the question. So who's kind of got the OKR head on? Where lies the time and effort to actually take care of all these roles? First of all, distinguish between the different roles. I think that's one of the few things that can add a lot of positive impact, have clarity around who is involved in what and why. And do we need everyone again, or do we need certain roles for certain things? Like, does everyone need to participate in every step of the OKR process? Is that really valuable, or can we maybe change that a little bit? And so to improve on that, creating distinct roles with distinct responsibility, I would say totally makes sense in the teams and beyond. And work with different levels of responsibility, knowledge, and involvement. Like, does every team member really need in-depth knowledge of OKRs? Probably not. Do they need a basic awareness? For sure. Does everyone need to have the entire process and timelines inside? Maybe at a certain level, but also not in depth. So really think about who needs what for which process step and why. Improve the clarity around roles and responsibilities. When I talk to teams, they spend so much time in clarifying, is that now my responsibility? Is that your task? Who is doing what? Oh, like, who did the update of the key results again? I think it was you, right? Oh yeah, do we have that? Oh no, we didn't. Like, all these little tasks, they add up so quickly and they kind of make the OKR process, so draining for everyone involved. And a tip from one of my customers, don't change roles too often. I think it takes some time and effort to get into the OKR process, to understand everything that's happening, to get to know stakeholders and all that. Like, don't just exchange your roles too often, to actually leverage the knowledge that has been built up over there as well. And rather establish tandems or self-organized groups to avoid that people are actually dependent on certain people. And last but not least, let people choose their roles. I think there's nothing more motivating than having actually people who like the topic of OKRs, who are actually interested to learn more, to go to meetings like this one, to meet other people, to kind of continuously improve if that is their inner motivation and not just their task that is assigned to them, right? So I want to close it with that. Christina Wodke, I think you're familiar with her, coined the term OKRs are like riding a bike. It seems very simple. It's not so easy to do. It's helpful to have somebody actually on your side to learn that. So I think that's also a plaidoyer from my side. Bring in experts internally or externally, whoever you have, to help teams in the beginning, because I think that is also one of the biggest levers to make it feel lightweight and more fun, because you don't have to do the initial learning all by yourself. And last but not least, look at your foundation first. Everything that we've mentioned now is kind of the nice add-on if you're already working, but if you don't know why you're doing things, if you don't have your system design set up great, if you don't kind of add to the change journey with what we said, leadership coaching and all these things, and actually know how you get started, all these levels will probably not get you very far. So in a nutshell, I would say balance the aspects from the tension triangle wisely. So be aware that all these things are interdependent. So it's not just making it more fun and that it will be less time consuming and more impactful as well. And work on the foundations to improve all aspects of OKRs long term. And if you're interested to talk a little more about that with the community, I will actually do a meetup next week to kind of continue the discussion around impact in particular. So feel free to join around that. And last but not least, don't forget to have fun while doing it. Thank you very much. And what kind of questions do you have? Yes, please.
Just a common one. You mentioned this cascade, purpose, vision, mission, strategy, and so on. And you cited a source or inspired by.
Oh, that was inspired by my colleague Chancel, because we did a keynote together and she pulled out a wonderful slide, and I just took that as an inspiration to create my own. So I always like to give the credits to people who inspire what I then work with. Yeah. Any other questions or comments? Also from people joining remotely. Not for now? Then I thank you very much for your attention. I'll be around for the coffee and the chat if you'd like to, and I wish you a wonderful afternoon.
Ich fand ihn sehr gut strukturiert. Und obwohl das jetzt schon die 3. Runde war, war es super leicht zuzuhören, fand ich. Also Kompliment an der Stelle.
Dankeschön, das freut mich.
Nochmal die Leute im Chat.
Ja.
Wollt ihr denen vielleicht einfach kurz schreiben, dass die andere Session noch on ist und wir so ungefähr in 5 Minuten auf der
Ja,
Mainstage sind? Das wäre super.
Ich schreibe rein.